Okay then, so welcome back for those of you who joined us earlier for the this morning session, and welcome if there's anyone who's joining for the first time. As you know, this is the Easter Sunday, and we have... Okay then, so welcome back for those of you who joined us. We have a special guest speaker from the all the way from UK for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Dr. Callum, and he has already shared one session with us this morning. And so now we're getting ready to share the second session, and the topic here is, where do human rights come from? And so once again, give a warm welcome to Dr. Callum. I give the time over to you.
Great. Let me just switch over to my PowerPoint to get that up. Hold on. Sorry, one moment. Okay. Great. Well, thank you for coming back. The great thing about Zoom is you can see how many people are in the meeting, so I can tell that not many people have left, which is for which I'm very grateful. Thanks so much for tuning in again for this second talk. This one I think is going to be a fair bit shorter. So again, please do use. I think Leon can send the website for sending in questions. Please do feel free to send in questions during the talk. About this topic, about the last topic, about anything, any kind of difficult questions on Christianity, and we'll try to get through those. This second one is going to be on where human rights come from, and I think this is a really helpful angle to take when it comes to kind of thinking about our own faith and why it might be justified, and also when trying to share that faith with others, because this is a topic that really everyone thinks about to some extent, or everyone should think about. Everyone has a concept of human rights and human equality, and everyone seems to think that where we get our moral values from is really important. But actually, we rarely think about that. We have a clear sense of human equality and a clear sense of human rights, and yet we rarely think kind of in detail. We rarely question, where does that actually come from? And when I kind of researched this talk a while ago, I really was surprised actually at just how clear some of the evidence is that really so much of our kind of modern thinking comes from Christianity. And that actually, if we didn't have Christianity, we would have a radically different culture that would actually look horrific to most people, and that most people would find really disturbing. And we'll see that as we go through some of the examples. But it means that when we're talking about kind of anything that comes up in modern life, you know, moral questions are very often raised in the news, on talk shows, in everyday conversations. And a good question that we can just simply ask is, how do we know what's true morally? How do we get our values? Where do we get them from? And is it important that we have a solid grounding for them? And hopefully I'll show that actually the solid grounding that does exist for most of our values does actually come from Christianity, and is very difficult to justify otherwise. Which means that people are really borrowing from Christianity for their values, and they might actually be much more Christian than they think already, which is a great commendation of the Christian faith. So the question I'm going to look at specifically today is the question of human equality. And there are kind of two elements to this. So there's the first question, what are humans worth? We like to think that we're equal and that we're infinitely valuable, that there are some rights that we have that are completely inviolable. No one can take them away. And we have a sense that we are infinitely valuable, infinitely treasured, and equally so. And then the second question, even if we agree that we're infinitely valuable and equally valuable, how do we know that? What is the justification for that? Do we have a firm basis for believing in human equality? On the face of it, it's actually quite difficult to understand where the idea of human equality come from. Because if you think about it, people are different in a huge number of different ways. I've had the privilege of traveling quite extensively over the last year. And one thing I noticed more than anything was just how different cultures are, even in countries that are pretty close to each other. As an example, I was recently in Holland, and I had to look up I was looking up some kind of key phrases for translation before I went, and I came across a kind of Dutch to English translation guide, but it wasn't translating languages. It was translating British phrases into what the British people actually mean when they say them. So, for example, when the British say you must come for dinner, others hear, I will get an invitation soon. But what the British really mean is, I hope I never see you again. There are many different differences between cultures, from, you know, the height to the, oh, can you still hear me? Sorry about that. There are huge differences between people. There are differences in size, in color, in nationality, differences between cultures in terms of their values, in terms of their languages, and so on. People have different mental abilities, people have different intelligence, people have different physical abilities, different economic abilities, different levels of development. And yet we have this clear sense that all of us are fundamentally equal. As someone once said, we want a world where we're all treated equally under the law, regardless of who we love, regardless of how we identify. That person was, of course, Taylor Swift, with whom I hope many of you are familiar. But she, I think, epitomizes and embodies this claim that most of us quite keenly feel, which is that humans are all ultimately equal. But this is strange if humans vary so much, because if humans are equal, then our equality can't be based on something we have in different degrees. So, for example, we have different degrees of mental abilities. And so if humans are equal, then it can't be that we're equal because of our mental abilities, because they're different. It has to be something that we all share in common to an equal degree. And this is a real threat, because if we don't have an adequate grounding for human equality, if we can't explain why we believe it in the first place, then actually it can be under significant threat. There was an essay published at the end of the Cold War by a political theorist, Francis Fukuyama, who described the fall of communism and before that fascism and the kind of ascent of liberalism as the final state of human history, the end point of our evolution as humans. And he said all that's left to do now is just to finish the universalization of liberalism, liberalism being this idea of human equality and human basic rights. But actually, of course, 30 or so years after the end of the Cold War, we don't see that across so much of the world. If we look across much of the world today, we have enormous inequalities economically. We have enormous inequalities embodied in the law at times. In many cultures, we have infanticide for disabled children, for example, and that's in both the East and the West. We have huge inequalities between so many different people in so many different parts of society. And it really seems that unless we have an adequate grounding for believing in human equality, it might well be under threat. So we have this ideal, this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This ideal says recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. This is the ideal. But of course, most cultures in history, and even many cultures across the world today, have simply not believed in these ideals in many ways. So most cultures in history have believed things like the following. They've said that human beings are fundamentally not equal, and especially women or children or people of other races or disabled people are less valuable and they have less dignity. Most cultures have been fine with infanticide, especially if the baby is a girl or is disabled. Most cultures have thought one of the supreme virtues is strength rather than, for example, compassion or love or kindness to the weak. They've thought that humility is a sign of weakness and that actually we should be asserting our strength and our power. They've said that love is not that important a virtue. And of course, many have said that humans were made for convenience for the gods, to do work for the gods, or humans were made by accident. And this, of course, is a deeply disempowering view of human beings, because what it means is that humans were not born with any ultimate purpose for relationship or to be treasured or to be cherished. It means that they were created either by accident or simply to do other people's work for them. Christianity, as we'll see, said something completely radical, completely different, that gave humans a new kind of dignity. So just to give some of those historical examples, this is a Roman soldier called Hilarion, who is stationed in Alexandria and is writing home to his wife. Hilarion's wife is pregnant and she's going to give birth while he's away in Egypt. And so he writes back to her and says, if by chance you do give birth, if it is a boy, let it be. If it is a girl, throw it out. And this was an entirely characteristic sentiment among the Romans and the Greeks and many other cultures in history and around the world even today. This is entirely common. It happened to baby girls, it happened to disabled babies, and no one saw any problem with discarding disabled or female infants, or sometimes healthy male infants, if they would have been a burden on the family. And our culture, of course, in Europe is very different to that today in many cases, though not in all cases. As I say, infants were routinely either actively killed by drowning or by strangling, or sometimes they would be exposed. So they would be put out to die from the cold or starvation, or even eaten by wolves, or often, perhaps most often, to be taken as slaves or prostitutes. And this was entirely common throughout the Roman period. And of course, throughout the Roman period in many other ways, and in many cultures, some lives have been worth more than others. Another couple of examples, Aristotle, from whom we frequently think we get kind of the basis of Western thought. When we think back to kind of the basis of Western civilization and the basis of democracy, we often think back to the Greeks, legendary Greek philosophers. But actually, if you look at what the Greeks thought, they really didn't believe that human beings were equal at all. So in Aristotle's book on politics, he describes what it means to be a slave. And so I won't read all of this, but what he says is that what being a slave means is someone who is by nature not his own, but another man's. That is, you're a slave if you are a possession of someone else. So he said being a slave means being a possession of someone else. And then he asks the question, well, is there anyone thus intended by nature to be a slave? Or rather, is not all slavery a violation of nature? And so he answers, there's no difficulty in answering this question. And of course, we would say the same thing. That's an easy question. Of course, no one should be a slave. No one is by nature the possession of someone else. But he answers the complete opposite. He says there's no difficulty in answering this question on grounds both of reason and of fact, for that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. Likewise, they had a very similar attitude towards other groups in society. The Greeks had quite strange views and quite diverse views about what happened at the end of your life. It certainly wasn't a kind of heaven or hell kind of worldview that they had. They had no concept of resurrection, and they had a variety of different ideas about what happens at the end of your life. And a common idea was that everyone in the universe had a soul that came from a star. There was a star out there in the universe for every single person on the earth. And if you lived a good life, you would go back out to join your star and kind of live for eternity in bliss at your star. So this is Plato, again, one of the kind of forefathers of democratic thought in some senses. He says, if a person lived a good life through the due course of his time, he would at the end return to his dwelling place in his companion star to live a life of happiness that agreed with his character. But then he goes on to say what happens if you don't live a good life, if you're bad, or if you mess up, your punishment. If he failed in this, he would be born a second time, now as a woman. This is obviously shocking to many, well, hopefully to all of us, but it was an entirely standard thought in the Greco-Roman worldview. Likewise, Aristotle said very clearly, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior. And of course, we are all too keenly aware of how common this sentiment still is in many places around the world, perhaps in most places around the world. This, of course, this idea that humans were not of equal value was not just an ancient idea. It's obviously very prevalent in the modern world. And actually, it began to make a huge resurgence with the area of disability at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th and 21st centuries. So one of the foremost proponents of euthanasia was actually primarily advocating it for disabled people involuntarily. He said that they should be euthanized without having any say in the matter. And unfortunately, this is what we see in many countries in Europe today. Many disabled people are euthanized against their will in Holland, for example. And so we are beginning to see the crumbling of this sense of human equality, and we begin to see just how fragile the idea of human equality really is. So as I say, we see this around the whole world today. So again, we have this ideal from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. But yet it seems that we don't really know where this ideal came from. We seem to all just think that it just kind of came out of nowhere. We just believe it because everyone's told us that it's true. We all agree on human equality, but we don't have much of a sense of where it came from historically or how we could justify it philosophically. So people have tried to justify this philosophically. They've tried to explain why it is that human beings would be equal. And for the most part, those philosophical explanations have been failures. And there are many reasons for this and many reasons why philosophers are now beginning to reject human equality, particularly philosophers working in bioethics. They're now saying that not all human beings are equal. And it's for a variety of reasons, but two of the main ones are these. The first is the influence of utilitarianism, which says a lot of different things, but one of the key points it makes is that there are no absolute rules other than maximizing happiness and minimizing pain. If you want to do something, you can do anything you want as long as it causes the maximum pleasure and the minimum pain. Now, what this means, it sounds perfectly plausible enough, but what it means is that there is no such thing as an inalienable right. You have no ultimate rights that can never be violated. Actually, whatever you think might be a right, your right to life, your right not to be tortured, your right not to be enslaved, is only dependent on the idea that that's what brings people happiness. If it brought enough people happiness to make you a slave, then they should do so. Now, many philosophers are not utilitarians, but it still had a huge impact on the way philosophers think. And of course, Jeremy Bentham, who founded utilitarianism, called the idea of natural rights, the idea that we have inalienable rights inherent to us. He called that idea nonsense on stilts. So you can do anything you want to anyone else as long as you cause a sufficient amount of pleasure to a sufficient number of people. Again, another concept that has kind of challenged the idea of human equality in philosophy. I won't go into detail on this. The idea, I've called it neo-Lockean views of personhood. Don't worry if you don't know what that means at all. You don't need to. All the idea is that there's this idea of personhood, which means that you only become a moral person with moral value, not just because you're a human being, but because you are a rational being, someone who is intelligent, someone who is self-aware, someone who is self-conscious. This is what it means to be a person with human rights. And because of the influence of this view on philosophy, philosophers have begun to say that actually human beings who don't live up to this mark simply don't have the same rights. And primarily disabled people and infants, they have said, do not live up to that standard and do not have the same human rights as other people. And so that is why, of course, in bioethics, we see people saying that infanticide might be permissible, or that involuntarily killing disabled people might be permissible, because they don't live up to that mark of personhood. And so this is the fundamental issue that philosophers have come across. They've come across this problem that if you try to ground human equality on a capacity that we have to varying degrees, if you try to base human equality on something that people have to differing extents, you can't really justify human equality. And so because many philosophers try to base human value on human capacities, they've realized that because different people have different capacities, then different people have different value. Not all people are equal. Some of them are more valuable than others. And so Jeff McMahon, the professor of moral philosophy at the University of Oxford, discusses this, and he spends a great length of time trying to explain human equality and trying to justify it. But in the end, he says, it doesn't really seem that it can be justified. He says, all of this leaves me profoundly uncomfortable. It seems virtually unthinkable to abandon our egalitarian commitments, our commitment to human equality. But it's hard to avoid the sense that our egalitarian commitments, our commitment to equality, rest on distressingly insecure foundations. He's quite clear that philosophy can't really seem to explain human equality. And so we have these two different problems. We have this historical problem where we don't really know where the idea of human equality came from historically, or at least most people in the general public don't know where human equality came from historically. And then we have the second problem that philosophically, it's extremely difficult to explain human equality. And what this means is that, as Jeff McMahon puts it, our idea of human equality is on distressingly insecure foundations. And therefore, it's quite likely to fall apart. And it's extremely fragile and vulnerable unless we get a clear, secure foundation for our idea of human equality and human dignity. Now, when we look at the historical question, we actually find that historians are not very divided on where human equality came from. Actually, if you look at the historical literature, it's very clear, and it's admitted by Christians and non-Christians, that the idea of human equality came from Christianity. Christianity is the historical reason for most of our beliefs about equality and about human rights. So Tom Holland, an agnostic historian, has written a huge long book recently called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, where he traces where this Western mentality comes from, this idea that everyone is equal and everyone has fundamental basic human rights. And he notes, as a Roman historian, that when he looked into this, when he began exploring this question, having always admired the Romans and having grown up loving the Romans and the Greeks, as he explored this question more and more, he realized how much he disliked them and how actually he was a Christian in his moral thinking. And so he writes in his book, if you wonder why there is any question of taking in refugees rather than just crucifying them, enslaving them and selling them off, ultimately it is down to the fact that Western Europe became Christian. The notion that there is a moral value to the poor and weak simply did not exist in ancient civilizations. Likewise, Peter Singer, who's perhaps the foremost bioethicist in the world, who's an atheist as well, he's very clear about where our opposition to infanticide, for example, comes from, and where our idea of the sanctity and the equality of human life comes from. He says, if we go back to the origins of Western civilization, there was no respect for the lives of slaves or other barbarians, and infants had no automatic right to life. Greeks and Romans killed deformed or weak infants by exposing them. Plato and Aristotle thought that the state should enforce the killing of deformed infants. And what he says is this changed because of Christianity. But then he goes on to say, because we are no longer Christians in our cultures, it's time to reevaluate our idea of human equality and our belief in the importance of being a human being. It's time to reevaluate our sense of human rights, because actually the only reason we believed it in the first place is because of Christianity. And without Christianity, we have to reject that belief. And so Peter Singer himself rejects the idea of human equality. He says that some human beings, disabled people and newborn babies, or even toddlers, are not equal human beings and potentially can have their lives ended if it benefits society. So we've seen quite clearly that actually this comes from Christianity. But what about Christianity was it that led to these revolutions? Well, I think there are two main areas, two main claims that the Judeo-Christian tradition made that explain where we got this idea from. The first is that humans are made in the image of God. Now, what does this mean? The image of God can sound quite abstract or mysterious. It can sound quite theological even, and it's not actually clear what it means. But I think we can get a good sense of this if we think about other times we talk about image. When we talk about image, we often talk about conforming to an image that other people have of us. We often think we have to conform to an image that magazines portray for us physically, or we have to conform to an image that our parents expect for us. We have to conform to a certain social image for our friends to like us and for our employers to like us. There are all sorts of images we have to conform to in order to be valued and respected and treasured and loved in society. And that is about conforming to another image that we don't necessarily have. But what the Bible says is that humans are already made in an image. They don't have to conform to an image. Humans are already made in the image of God, which means that they reflect God. They have the dignity of God, and that they don't have to conform to any other of these societal expectations to be loved. They are loved purely because they are already made in the image of the most infinitely valuable thing or person that could ever possibly exist. And that gives them such amazing infinite value without them having to achieve it or without them having to do anything to earn it. Now, the second reason, of course, that Christians believed in human equality is because of what they said about God himself coming to earth. They said that Jesus died for every single human. Now, this was extremely radical. The idea that God would become a human was crazy in the first place. The idea that he would become a human and die was even crazier. But the idea that he would become a human and die, not just for the most important people or for the religious people or for the upper class people or for the rich people, but that he would die for the lowest of the low, that he would die for the slave, for the disabled person, for the leper, for the outcast, for the orphan. The idea that God himself would consider those lives so valuable that they are worth God himself giving his life for. That was an absolutely crazy idea, and it was an absolutely revolutionary idea that meant we now have a clear sense of just how much the lowest in society are worth. The lowest in society are worth the blood, the death, the life of God himself. God gave his life for every single person, and that shows and proves just how valuable they are. They are infinitely valuable, and of course, because of that, they are equally valuable to each other. And these are the kind of the earthquakes in Christian theology, the earthquake claims that completely revolutionized the world, that showed people clearly once and for all that humans really are equal. And so we can answer these two questions that we set out with. The first question, what are we worth? Well, we are made in the image of God equally, and we are worth the sacrifice of God himself. That means we are infinitely and equally valuable. And how do we know this? Well, we know this because God really did come and give himself for us. He didn't just say it in a book. He didn't just tell us through a religious tradition. He came to earth in history and actually gave his life for us to show us just how valuable we are. And of course, rose again, offering us eternal life so that he can love us and that we can be in relationship for eternity. So, as I said, this talk has been quite a bit quicker. I'd love to hear your questions. Please do get sending them in through the website. I'm happy to take questions on this topic, on the resurrection, or the evidence for the Bible, or any other topic that you have challenging questions about Christianity with respect to. And so thank you so much for your patience for both of these talks. I know it's a lot of content, it's a lot of information. Again, I'm happy to send out the slides for both of them, but I really appreciate your patience and your hopefully your interest in these talks. And I'd love to hear some of your questions and chat a bit more about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much once again, Dr. Callum, for your sharing. And so we did have some questions that we didn't have time to answer before, and I think a couple of more have popped in since then. So just a reminder, if you want to ask some questions, go to menti.com and use the code 411148. And I think it's also in the chat in the Zoom. So you have to open up the chat to see that code. So the first question that has the most upvotes here actually is, am I a Christian if I can't wrap my head around the resurrection?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think it kind of depends, I guess, what you mean a little bit by that. And I don't mean for that to sound kind of menacing at all or anything. All I mean by that is that Christianity is ultimately based on this central event of the resurrection. And the resurrection is a really central and key, essential part of Christian thought. As I said in the other talk, Paul himself writes, if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is futile and you're still in your sins. Of course, if he has been raised, then it changes everything. And so what I would say is that the resurrection is an essential part of Christianity, and it is an absolutely key element of the story that Christianity is useless without, because that's what gives us our hope, and that's what gives us the hope that we have of having eternal life with God. But that has to be separated from, I think, two other questions, which are, can I still be a Christian if I have doubts about the resurrection? And can I still be a Christian if I can't fully understand the resurrection? And the answers to those questions is yes. You can be a Christian if you have kind of lingering doubts about the resurrection, or if there are parts about it that seem difficult to believe. Most of us have doubts about things, and most of us quite naturally have doubts all the time. But it doesn't mean that you're not a Christian. In fact, the Bible does set a clear pattern throughout the Bible of asking God challenging questions, and biblical characters, the heroes of the faith, wrestling with their most difficult questions. They don't always understand God. They don't always understand the doctrine that God teaches. They don't always understand the ways God works. And certainly they often have doubts, and they bring those doubts to God and challenge him. The Bible is clear that you can be a follower of God while still having those doubts. And so I don't want you to be disheartened. If you're struggling with doubts, it doesn't mean that you failed in your faith. It doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong or that you're not a Christian. But what I would really encourage you to do is to bring those doubts to people who perhaps have read more about this. Try to articulate those questions. Try to figure out exactly what you're wrestling with, and try to get answers. With the ministry I work for, the whole point of our ministry is to answer difficult questions about Christianity and try to make a bit more sense of those confusing parts of it. And there are many, many resources out there that we can give, or that other church leaders can give, that can help you work through those doubts or those difficult questions. But one way I quite like to think about it, especially, is if you've been in an aeroplane with turbulence, you'll know that as you go through turbulence on an aeroplane, it can feel absolutely horrendous. It can feel completely scary, and you can feel completely at risk. Even just the last flight I was on, there was quite a big part of me that was just pretty sure the airplane was just going to fall from the sky and that we all die. And yet, even despite that, I kind of knew in some sense that it was safe, that I knew the statistics about airplanes. I wasn't going to kind of go on that gut feeling to just jump out of the airplane to try and with a parachute to try and save my life. Because actually I knew deep down intellectually there was a good basis for it, even though I had these kind of psychological doubts that made me really worry about whether the plane was safe. I had that intellectual underpinning that told me aeroplanes are, for the most part, extremely safe. And I think the same is true with Christianity. We often feel like our faith is shaken. We often feel like there are things we don't understand, or even that we feel like we're desperate, or we are abandoned, or we're lost, or we're hopeless. We can certainly feel that way as Christians. But having this intellectual underpinning, this robust evidence for Christianity, can really help us in sustaining us through those times. And as I say, it doesn't mean that you're not a Christian to have those doubts. What I just say is I'd encourage you to bring those doubts to other people so that you can explore them and try to get good answers, rather than kind of worrying about them to yourself and worrying that you're being fake because of it. All of us have those doubts, and your church leaders, I'm sure, would love to work through them with you and will not judge you at all for having them.
Thank you for your answer. And like Helen mentioned or alluded to, that these kind of small groups that we're having should be the place where we would be able to share these kind of doubts if we have any. And so please do not hesitate to contact your small group leader or someone else you trust in the church. Do not wrestle on about this on your own, because we're here together in this. Next up, I have a question I guess it's a little bit more personal question for you. What was a vital evidence that convinced you that Jesus is real and led you to become a follower of Christ?
Yeah, great question. I actually was really convinced by the historical evidence, and I don't think I would be a Christian if I hadn't kind of looked into the historical evidence for it. I read a book called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel that I really found he's a journalist who was an atheist, and he set out to try to disprove Christianity because his wife became a Christian and he wanted to disprove it. And as he looked into it, he was convinced by the historical evidence and became a Christian and then a pastor himself. So I read his book and I was very, very convinced by it. And of course, I kept my critical hat on. I read other books, read people who disagreed, but I really found that the evidence, firstly for the resurrection, and then secondly for Jesus's claims about himself, claiming to be the Son of God, the Son of Man, claiming to be able to do things that only God can do, claiming to offer eternal life. I found the evidence that he said those things convincing, and that I couldn't explain them other than by saying he really was the real deal. Now, it took a long time for me to kind of bring that intellectual knowledge to following Jesus properly and well. Even now, obviously I always make mistakes and still not perfect, but it did take a long time for my kind of intellectual conviction of the truth of Christianity to really work its way into following Jesus with my heart. And for that, it really took just some incredible experiences of forgiveness from God and from people that I'd hurt, showing me just how sinful I was and how much I needed to have God's forgiveness. And how in gratitude to that forgiveness, that gratitude can turn you towards following Jesus and trusting in him that he will give you a new heart and that he will renew you day by day so that you can follow him better. So it was a mix of the intellectual arguments at first and then really having a really deep sense of God's forgiveness after that.
Thank you so much for your answer. We have another question. So I guess we have another 12 minutes roughly. So hopefully you're okay with answering more questions.
Sure.
So the next one is about predestination. And it says, do you believe that God has predestined who will believe in him? And how does that work in relation to free will and kind of individual responsibility?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to find that one a little difficult to answer just because Christians differ on their answers to that question quite a lot. So the idea that God predestines people, that he kind of decides who follows him and who doesn't, is most associated with a particular kind of doctrine or I guess kind of denomination within Christianity known as Calvinism. And they would say that God does predestine people, and they would have answers for why he might do that and how that might be just. For my own part, I don't think that God does predestine people. I do think we have a genuine choice, but I think God can know that choice in advance. So I don't think it means God is lacking knowledge. I just think God can see in advance what we will do, but he still allows us to freely make that choice. And I think this is, for some people, that can be quite kind of counterintuitive, that God can know things in advance and yet people still be free. But actually, when you look into the kind of analytic philosophy of that, I actually teach this topic at university in tutorials. And when you look into the philosophy of that, there are pretty good responses for how God can have foreknowledge. He can see things in the future and how people can still be free. A very quick example in a way is that is I guess to think of the idea that knowing something in advance doesn't mean that you cause that thing in advance. So if I kind of go outside, which I'm not really allowed to do at the moment, I understand many of you are in Sweden at least. If I go outside, I can see things that are about to happen. I can maybe see that a car is about to crash into something. but it doesn't mean that I've caused it or that I've predestined it. So there are ways that we can see things in the future without actually causing or predetermining them. And I think the same is true with God. He can see in the future and he knows what we will do, but he doesn't predestine us to do so. But as I say, that is controversial within Christianity, and different Christians will have very different beliefs on that.
Thank you. Let's see. The next question I have here is, are there historical evidence for the ascension of Jesus as well? So we talked about the resurrection, but what about the ascension?
Yeah, good question. I just have to think about how to approach that. I would say that essentially, anything in the Gospels has at least some historical evidence, namely that at least one historian, one of the writers of the Gospels, recorded it. The essential, so I don't think in order to reasonably believe something, we have to have sources outside of the Bible for it. If we can show that the Bible is generally a reliable document, then we can also use it as a historical document as evidence for particular occurrences. As an example, there are many things in history for which there is only one source, but that historical source is still evidence for that thing. And so the Bible, Luke at least records the ascension, and I think Matthew does as well. You might have to correct me. I don't have my Bible open right at this moment, but there's at least one, possibly two, records of the ascension in the Bible. And if we treat the Bible as a series of historical documents, which it is, it's more than that, but it's not less than that, then we have some direct historical evidence just because the Bible, which is generally reliable historically, has given that evidence. There's no other kind of direct evidence for it outside the Bible. I guess the only thing I'd say is that the ascension can be kind of implied or inferred from the fact that we have very good evidence of Jesus' resurrection, but of course we know that Jesus is not on earth at the moment. At least we can't find him anywhere. And that those kind of the combination of those two things, the very good evidence for the resurrection combined with the fact that he's no longer there, I think would be in some sense pretty good evidence for the ascension or something like it.
Thank you. Just want to remind people that even though you don't have maybe questions of your own, you can still vote for the questions so that you can affect which question to get answered by logging into the same link on menti.com. So the next question I have is one regarding the Old Testament and the creation story. So how does the creation story in the Old Testament fit with evolution?
Yeah, another great question. Again, this is an issue that lots of Christians would have different views on. And so I'm wary that I don't want to say something too controversial. But there are Christians who, broadly, there are kind of three kinds of views on this among Christians. There's young earth creationists who believe that the world is 6,000 years old, and that essentially Genesis is to be mostly interpreted as literally as possible. There are old earth creationists who believe that the world is very old and that the days in the Genesis refer to long periods of time, for example. But nevertheless, God created humans, especially kind of from the dust or from nothing. And then theistic evolutionists are people who believe in God and who believe that humans evolved. This is very different from believing in secular evolution, because if a Christian believes in evolution, then they can believe that God made humans by a process. My view is the latter view, that evolution did occur and that God did create us through evolution. And there are a number of kind of different ways that might be problematic for the Genesis story. So I'll just go through a couple. The first is that does the Bible say that God, how does the Bible say God created us? Well, actually, the Bible does say that God created us from dust. It doesn't say that God created us from nothing. It doesn't say that God created us kind of ex nihilo. It says that actually we are basically earthy creatures. We're made from the dust. We're made from the earth. That's exactly what Genesis says. And often in the Bible, God does things through natural processes. So the authors of the Bible talk a lot about God sending the rain, God making the plants grow, God helping with the agriculture and things like that. But of course, they still believed in agriculture. They still believed in the laws of nature. They just thought that God was behind it all. And so likewise with evolution, God can create things like humans through a natural process, and it's still God creating it. Now, there are a number of other points where evolution might kind of be problematic for the story in Genesis. I can perhaps send some resources if anyone's particularly interested in this question. But perhaps the only other question, perhaps the most central one, is the question of Adam and Eve. And all I'd say on that very briefly is that there are some people, I guess, who would be theistic evolutionists who don't believe that Adam and Eve were literal people. They would say, for example, that Adam means man in Hebrew, and Eve means mother. And so they might take it they might take kind of Adam and Eve not to be historical people, but to be kind of metaphors for humanity as a whole. But my view, and I think church tradition supports this better, is that Adam and Eve are compatible with evolution, that at some point in evolution, there were a particular historical couple, maybe not called Adam and Eve, we don't know for sure, but there were a historical couple from which we get the narratives in Genesis. And I think there are ways of combining with that with evolution. And so I don't think believing in evolution means that you have to get rid of believing in Adam and Eve. So I've tried to kind of lay out the different options without giving too much away about my own, but I do that mainly just to give you a sense of what the different possibilities are. And there are pros and cons of each. Some of them might be more acceptable, some of them less acceptable, but those are the possibilities. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you so much. I think we have time for maybe one or maybe two more. Let's see. The top one now is, I guess, a popular question. Why does God allow suffering? And it also adds a few more details now or in the Bible. I guess suffering back in the Bible or suffering in current day. And then the last part is, did God create evil?
Okay, yeah, well, that will probably be the last question because it's a pretty big one. I will. The way I try to think about it this way, I set it up into kind of three kind of answers. And what I'd say before any of that is that this is a very difficult personal question. There's no general answer to why God allows suffering, and actually theorizing about it intellectually is not always the most helpful thing to do. What we need most in suffering is compassion and comfort, and for people to be with us, giving us that comfort. And the Bible actually, I think, gives us amazing resources to cope with suffering. But how can we think about it intellectually? Well, the first thing we can say is we don't necessarily need to know everything about how something works in order to trust it. I don't really know how aeroplanes work, but I trust them because the evidence shows that the people who fly them are good and they're trustworthy, and I can rely on them, even though I don't understand how they work. If you are in a battle, for example, and your commander, who you know is a good person, you know they're trustworthy and they know what they're doing, they might make a strategic move that you don't understand at all, that you think is crazy. But because of the rest of the evidence you have of their goodness, you realize that you can rationally trust them, even when you don't understand everything they do. And so the first thing I'd say is just to set our limits appropriately and understand that we might not necessarily be able to understand everything that God does or why things happen to us. That doesn't mean that God isn't trustworthy. It just means that we don't necessarily have all the answers at that point. The second thing I'd say is that we can actually give some reasonably good suggestions about why God might allow suffering or evil. And one of the suggestions, of course, is free will, which many people talk about, that free will means that God has to allow at least the possibility of suffering. Otherwise, we simply can't have free will. Another idea which I actually find more persuasive is that there are some good things in the world that that we could not have without something bad in the first place. If we think about some of the best virtues that people have, or some of the most amazing stories of humanity, they tend to be stories involving someone overcoming something that was bad. They're stories of forgiveness or courage or bravery or mercy. And all of these things have to have something bad in the first place. You can't be forgiving if no one has ever done something wrong. And actually, I think if we just had a world where there was never any suffering, we would be missing some of these things that make the world unique and some of these things that make human achievements so incredible. And then finally, I'd say, kind of following on from both of those first 2 points, we don't necessarily need to know why God allows every instance of suffering. What we need to know is, are we in it alone? And is there hope? And is there meaning? And I think Christianity gives unique resources for answering those. It says that we're not alone because God didn't just look on us in our suffering. He didn't just say he had compassion. He actually came to earth himself and suffered just as we do. So God, in the truest sense, identified with our suffering so that we're not alone. But he also said that there is hope and there is meaning through it. He said there's meaning because suffering can be turned from something that seems pointless and that seems irrational, that seems kind of to make no sense. He can turn that into something profoundly meaningful. The best example is Jesus on the cross. From one perspective, from a worldly perspective, it looks like someone just being absolutely tortured innocently and going through the worst suffering for no reason at all. And yet Christians realize that that was the most profound, important, significant event in human history, because that suffering was not just about someone going through pain. That suffering was God sacrificing himself on behalf of us. So Jesus turned that from a story of simple pain and suffering into a story of profound sacrifice and love and forgiveness and freedom. And so if God is the author of Jesus's story and can turn Jesus's pain into something so profound, then if he's also the author of our story, then that means that he can turn our pain into something profound. And finally, of course, there's hope. And we have this hope because of today, because of Easter. Jesus said that death is not the end, suffering is not the end. And in Revelation, it says there will be a day where every tear will be wiped away by God himself. He will personally wipe away every tear. There will be no more death, no more pain, no more suffering, no more grief. And that is the hope that comes to us because of Jesus conquering death and saying that death doesn't have the final answer. So I hope that gives some idea. There's much, much more that could be said about it, but that's the shortest I can do on that really difficult question.
Thank you so much. I think that's one of the most popular questions near the end there. So that was the end of session 2. Thank you once again, Dr. Callum, for your sharing and for joining us this weekend. And I'd just like to give you a big hand, but I guess you'll only hear like one guy clapping. So, but I believe everyone else is clapping in their hearts or in their homes. So thank you once again. And I guess for now, we will have a short break of about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and then we'll have a small group discussion. And remember that at the end, at around 4 o'clock, we're gathering back together in this main session to round off our Easter weekend conference here. So thank you so much, Dr. Callum, for joining us, and wish you all have a great day. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I hope one time in future we will be able to do all this in person, but thanks so much for having me anyway, and look forward to seeing you at some point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay then.